In this video, we are going to be reviewing Jordan Peterson's recent interview with Piers Morgan. They talk about important issues like Andrew Tate, social media influencers, the state of masculinity, and a lot more. So I can't wait to delve into this video.
Joined again by Jordan Peterson. Jordan, it's been 1 year, can you believe that, since you came and sat in my studio and we had what was an extraordinary interview, got very emotional one part of it. Can you believe it's a year? And what kind of reaction did you have to that interview? Because some of the clips went so big and everyone was having a view about it. What was your reaction?
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, and I'm never that happy really when I become emotional about something that's being discussed. And sometimes for me, that's a consequence of not exactly optimal health. You know, it makes me a little bit more emotionally fragile than I'd like to be. But by the same token, I wasn't unhappy with it. I do still hold to my belief that I am addressing a loss, a demoralization among young people, and maybe particularly young men, and that I don't feel that there's anything inappropriate about that. And, you know, I have toured all over the world, and I've seen the extent of demoralization among young people, and it is very affecting if you have a clue, as far as I'm concerned. And so we touched on that. And I mean, other than that, I was very happy. I was very happy overall with the interview and with the manner in which people received it.
That, I think, is something very important. Of course, Jordan Peterson has been criticized by people like Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate about, oh, why is he showing emotion? But I do think it is a case of that. Although showing emotion isn't good on a regular basis, it's not the case that, well, okay, every single expression of emotion is bad. It's very reasonable for someone, especially someone like Jordan Peterson, who is a psychologist, who's actually experienced and talked to people and understand the suffering and the tragedy that happens in people's lives, to naturally feel sad and touched and emotionally moved. Because it's one thing to say, well, okay, a man cries all the time, to then say, well, a man cries sometime, and then to the statement that a man cries once in his life. For example, even Jesus Christ wept in the Garden of Gethsemane when he recognizes the grave burden that's on his shoulders. It's not the case of the crying that makes him emasculate in any sense of the imagination, but it is precisely because it is only those few times that he cries that everyone then recognizes how big the problem is. And I think that his show of emotion by Jordan Peterson is purely a recognition or a representation of the problem that is in society today. So I would not say, or follow Andrew Tate's or Tristan Tate's logic, that in any sense his showing of emotion was in any sense making him weaker than otherwise.
I interviewed Steven Pinker recently, and he'd always said for years that we've never had it so good as a planet, that statistically, whether it was poverty or health or age or whatever it may be, that on almost every recordable metric, this is the best time to ever be alive. And I asked him whether post the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis around the world, did he still feel that held true? And he said, yes, but actually despite that, this is the best time, actually in many ways, to ever be alive. When I read your Twitter feed, which I find fascinating, exciting, challenging, combative, but often quite furious, I get a sense of somebody quite angry with the state of the world. Is that a fair reflection of your state of mind about the world? If so, why?
Well, we've swapped adventure for security. And Pinker rightly points to the fact that on the grounds of material security as well, satiety, satisfaction, let's say, we're doing better than we ever have. But people aren't built for infantile satiation. They're built for truthful adventure, as far as I'm concerned. And so to the degree that we've purchased security and safety at the cost of existential adventure, that is not an advance. Now, I think, being optimistic like Pinker, that we could have an adventure. We could have our cake and eat it too. Let's put it that way. We could make the world an abundant place, and there would still be room for an adventure for everyone. But I think the existential or the Enlightenment types like Pinker, they make a mistake when they presume that mere material well-being is sufficient to provide people with the meaning that's necessary to offset the fundamental existential uncertainty of their lives.
This is a very interesting point because, of course, he's leaning upon the tradition of the Enlightenment thought in relationship to how we should view humans. The Enlightenment thinkers have always made the claim that as long as you gave people perfect reason and a perfect world, everything is going to go right. However, the reality is it seems to suggest that humans, if given a perfect world, would just find some way to destroy it. And that's Dostoevsky's argument in Notes from Underground. He's arguing that, well, even if you gave humans a very beautiful world, they would still manage to find a way to completely destroy the system. I think that hypothesis is just as strong, if not even more powerful, than the Enlightenment hypothesis, and it's just backed by so much anecdotal reasoning. Just think about all those rich, spoiled brats in the world. They don't seem to live a perfect life just because they've been giving millions and millions of dollars to grow up with. No, they often live the most morally corrupt lives out there. In the same sense, when we're thinking about, well, actually, how do we get to our goals? How do we actually live our lives in a productive way? Well, perhaps even though materialistically our lives have gotten better, that's not the full picture that we're wrestling with. We're wrestling with life on an existential, a meaning, a challenge of meaning. And that's what Jordan Peterson is trying to illustrate in his lectures, in his talks, and in his presentation right here.
I'm absolutely appalled that the globalist utopian elitists would sacrifice the poor to save the planet, especially when there's no evidence whatsoever that they're actually effectively saving the planet. And we could take Germany as a case in point there. And I would say the UK to some degree. But I'm fundamentally optimistic. I think that human beings can solve any problem that's set in front of them. And this is also another place where I think the apocalyptic utopians have got something seriously wrong. Like, they basically take a zero-sum approach to economic analysis of the world. We have finite resources. There's only room for a certain number of people. And so, of course, that begs the question of what in your world you're going to do with all those excess people. And we have to move towards degrowth, or there's going to be an apocalypse. And I think everything about that set of presuppositions is wrong. We don't live in a zero-sum universe. The apocalyptic outcome that everyone's predicting isn't necessary. And the more fundamental truth of the matter is that if people adopt subsidiary responsibility, and we could get into what that means, and we organize our social hierarchies effectively and generously, we could make the desert bloom. We can make much out of virtually nothing. And human beings have that capacity because we can transform cognitively. And there's no reason to assume at all that we couldn't have more than enough for everyone. Now, that would mean those who want more for themselves than for other people would have to let go of that essentially power-mad desire and be willing to share and be willing to raise the poor out of poverty. And of course, doing so decreases the gap between rich and poor, and that's very annoying if you're narcissistic and rich.
I think Jordan Peterson raises a very interesting point here. Firstly, against the global utopians, he does raise a potent criticism that, well, in reality, when we're thinking about the world, what actually are our goals? Are we trying to save the world? Are we trying to save the human species? Because those two things are very vastly different things. Some people like to say, well, we have to save the world for our next generation. But then, then you have a conflict of values, because providing a society which is good for our next generation might not be a society which is good for the world, and vice versa. So it's very important that we actually fundamentally understand where we're coming from in our analysis. Now, apart from that, I would like to say that Jordan Peterson here is actually a very interesting guy, because he's not going too far away from a socialist capitalistic society. Now, of course, we know that Jordan Peterson isn't a socialist or a communist, but at the same time, is that question about, well, if people were morally virtuous, perhaps the world would be a better place. And I think everyone can grant that. But the question is, well, is the world morally virtuous? Answer is no. And well, if the world is not morally virtuous, how would we create that situation that Jordan Peterson is working towards if we base it on the assumption that the world's not morally virtuous? Where do we get from there? And that's another question that has to be debated as well.
Institute in New York. And you said something really interesting to me. How do you have the adventure of your life? You asked the people there, including many students. And your answer was, tell the truth. And then it's so bloody interesting and engaging and exciting that it justifies the misery of your existence. What can I tell you? There are great books. Read them, ignore your professors. I did love that because actually there is a real power, isn't there, to the truth, particularly in this era, I think, where there's so much untruth and disinformation flying around. Actually being true to yourself is probably the most powerful thing you can be, I think.
Well, you can think about that in two ways. I mean, the first way is, who are you if you lie? Now, I would say, well, you're false if you lie. That seems self-evident. If you're false when you lie, then who are you? You're not you. And so then whatever happens to you when you lie, that isn't happening to you. And the theological view of that is that whatever happens to you when you lie is happening to the spirit of the lie, right? And the spirit of the lie, classically speaking, is a demonic spirit. And so whatever success you accrue as a consequence of lying isn't your success. It accrues to the glory of the spirit who lies. And that's a very bad idea. But then as well, the adventurous element of the truth is associated with the following idea. I mean, I could come on this interview, let's say, and I could have been thinking this morning, well, what in the world do I want to accomplish if I get to talk to Piers Morgan? I'm going to talk to several million people. How can I grow my brand? How can I use this opportunity to ensure that people feel better about me or admire me more? Or something hypothetically self-serving, eh? But it's not self-serving exactly. It would serve a very narrow part of myself. It would serve the narcissistic, self-aggrandizing, whim-oriented, hedonistic element of myself. And maybe I would confuse that with myself, but that would be foolish. And then maybe I would get what I aimed at, and I'd have an impressive conversation with Piers Morgan, and that would redound temporary to my glory, and I would walk away satisfied. But the problem with that is it's a stupid goal. And if I attained it, that would just make me successful at being foolish and narcissistic. And the consequence of doing that repeatedly would be that I would become more and more foolish and narcissistic. And there's no success in that. Even if I got rich doing that, I'd be rich and pathetic. And that's not helpful. And alternatively, I could come on here and I could just try to say what I believe to be the case. And then that would be me. And it would be the truth. And then I would be aligned with reality, which seems like a good idea, you know, because if it's you against reality, like, good luck to you. But there's more to it, Piers, because, see, if I want to come onto your program saying, just say what I think, I have to throw caution to the wind. I can't be calculating the outcome. I can't be, like, what would you say, referring to an opinion poll and telling people what they want to hear. I just have to lay it on the line. And to do that, I have to let go of the outcome. But the cool thing, here's the cool thing. If you let go of the outcome, you don't know what's going to happen. And then that's so interesting, really, that it's almost unbearable. And that is definitely something so interesting that it's almost unbearable. That's an adventure. And then you get to have an adventure. And then you think, wow, well, this is so interesting. Maybe it's worth sticking around for and trudging through the misery just to see how it ends.
I think that's a very valuable lesson. And, this is one thing I always tell people who talk to me, and I've seen my fair share of spoiled brats in Hong Kong. I mean, I grew up in one of the private schools, and a lot of people, they were completely spoiled. It's something I always tell people who know them or feel disheartened when people are showing off and doing things like that. It's, hey, look, ultimately, at the end of the day, they're not true to themselves. They're not acting in an integral manner which supports good values and nurtures their souls. And as a result, don't worry about that. It's very easy to look at people who are deceitful and make money from their deceit and their lies and their evil doings, but that's not us. It's very important that we recognize that, yes, people can go around doing things like that, but that's purely because Satan is a prince of the world. There's evil forces in this world at work, which is diametrically opposed to the good in this world. And if you're doing good in this world and you achieve success, that's so much better than just saying, well, I'm going to try to fake it by going into the evil in this world and trying to raise yourself via that. At the end of the day, we all have to be true to ourselves. And the true question is, when you die and you go to heaven or you go to hell and God says, well, look at this mirror, look at yourself. Can you really be true to yourself and via your own successes say, well, hey, look, have I done my best with what I've been given? If you've been lying and being a fake person, you can't even get to the step of saying, well, okay, this is what I've done. You can't even look yourself in the mirror and say, that's me. That's not even my achievement. And if that's the case, well, how are you going to face yourself both in a finite way and in an infinite way? And if you can't face yourself in an infinite way, how can you truly sleep well at night? And how can you truly say that that is success? So that's just something which I think Jordan Peterson touches on very beautifully. And it's such an important thing to keep in mind when you may be feeling disheartened by people around you who might be doing better than you, but via dishonest means.
Anybody who talks about misinformation and disinformation, that the misinformation and disinformation that other people are spreading, is like they immediately invalidate themselves as a serious observer in my viewpoint, because they're basically arbitrary censors. I mean, it's not as if we have some stellar and completely omniscient manner of distinguishing truth from falsehood, which is why we have free speech, so we can hash things out. And if people are foolish enough to believe that there's some straightforward way of identifying the purveyors of mis and disinformation, which is what the UN insists upon now, then they are in fact identifying themselves as the prime purveyors of such falsehood.
I think what Jordan Peterson says about misinformation is so true. Misinformation these days has become a sledgehammer used by extremes on the left and on the right to just sledgehammer who they disagree with. Because you think about it, no liberal would use the word misinformation to criticize a high school student in their algebra class saying, hey, look, I can't do 56 times 78 off the top of my head. I think it's 2. Of course, it's wrong, but well, and that's technically misinformation, but then you're not going to complain and say that kid is using misinformation to delude his friends around him in class when he says or comes up with that mathematical error. Rather, you would just throw it at someone else who's just potentially in the stretch of the imagination made a similar philosophical mistake, and then you'll suddenly label them as misinformation. Where are your standards here? What are your categories of what misinformation is or what misinformation is not?
I mean, what's extraordinary right now, you've been ordered, I don't even know if that's the right word to use, to take social media training by a Canadian court because you posted tweets criticizing the transgender and body positivity movements. My first question is, do you intend to do this?
Oh, well, I've got all sorts of evil plans on that front. I mean, at the moment, we've appealed the decision of the court in Canada to allow the college to proceed with their re-education of me. Now, the re-education, one of the criteria of the re-education program is that I'm required to sit down with a social media expert, whatever the hell that is, because that's not a genuine occupation. I don't even know how you define it. And I'm supposed to also, as a clinician, be very careful about how I allow myself to be educated, let's say. I'm supposed to educate myself according to the tenets of scientific investigation, for example, or recognized clinical practice, and social media expert doesn't fit into those categories. Anyways, I'm supposed to sit down with a social media expert, and then I'm supposed to modify my attitude, however I'm supposed to do that, until they're satisfied that I've changed. And, that's not that likely as far as I can tell, because I haven't changed since I was 3 years old, really, in some core elements. And I do that at my own expense for an unlimited amount of time until they've decided in their wisdom that I've learned whatever the hell set of lessons I'm supposed to learn. And so we've appealed that decision.
I have to say, this entire thing is really ridiculous. I mean, I keep my eye on what's happening to Jordan Peterson, and it's honestly really, really sad. Like, I don't understand how someone can possibly be forced to go through such stuff in what is apparently called a free world. I mean, reality, the world isn't free. We're stuck in the matrix, and that's something I actually agree with Andrew Tate, is that the world is surrounded by people who are at the top, who have their own agendas to make people at the bottom weak. And what's the best way to make people weak? Then make them try to switch genders, try to make them morbidly obese, try to completely destroy their understanding of self and everything. Of course, they're going to try to do that. Every single motive and every single mode of existence that is being promoted by movies, news shows, press releases, everything by the Matrix is there to make us weak. And it's very important that we recognize the tools that they're using and actually be able to dodge it. Because if you don't recognize the tools of the enemies, you're going to find yourself subject to it. And it's very important that we recognize it. And I feel very bad for Jordan Peterson that he has to undergo this. And I hope nothing I've said just now will make me have to do the same thing at Oxford. But I mean, it is what it is. It is life, and we just have to move on with it, right? We have to fight through it. And, you know, it's a sad reality that we're living in this world, but we do need people to fight against the matrix. And for better or for worse, whatever Andrew Tate is doing, whatever Jordan Peterson is doing, they're raising up a group of young men, I think, who do have their values, and hopefully over time that would displace the strength and power structures in the world. Will it be successful? I don't know. But at the same time, I think a lot of times the problems that we see today is because that the conservative right were too weak, or at least too reluctant to actually do anything about the left leading media until it was a bit too late. So it's very important that people recognize the powers that they have and actually take advantage of what they have and their potential and how that can impact the world around them.
You know, I'll tell you something else that's funny about the accusations. So so I'm being pursued by evil clowns that are incompetent, which makes it even more comical. So you can go submit a complaint about me. By the way, if anyone listening wants to go submit a complaint about me, this is how you do it. You go to the CP Ontario website and you look up complaints, and you can submit one from anywhere in the world. And you have to fill in this form that tells the people you're complaining to just why I'm a disgrace to the profession. But the first question you're asked is that if you were a client of mine, because, you know, you think that might be relevant. And I think it's 4 out of the 6 complainants whose complaints they are pursuing claimed in writing at the beginning of their complaints to be clients of mine, which they weren't. And not only were they not clients of mine, they didn't know any clients of mine, and they didn't even know any of the people whose feelings I'd hypothetically hurt by my tweets. And that was the beginning of the complaint process. And so I pointed that out to them, you know, because I sent them like 40 questions, none of which they answered. And one of them was, well, doesn't it strike you as somehow odd that you're taking the word of someone who doesn't even live in the country, often, who was never a client of mine, who claimed in writing to be one, and that's the basis of your prosecution?
The scene in Oppenheimer where Oppenheimer had to face that trial behind closed doors, where he could not ask questions and got challenged and just got completely destroyed by unfair witnesses, unfair questioning, and unfair means of justice used to try to just shame Oppenheimer in that series of trials. Well, the reality ultimately is that I feel that Jordan Peterson might have to face something similar. He's, as he clearly says just now, he's facing such problems. People are throwing accusations at him where he has no ability to defend himself in a proper and just way. Every idea of a fair trial and a fair judgment is completely thrown out the window by what these ridiculous people on the left are trying to do to get him to change his ideas, his apparently dangerous and stupid ideas in relationship to this matrix web of lies and deceit. So it's a very sad situation that we're seeing in the world today, but I am very afraid that this is what's going to carry on until we actually gain enough power to overthrow this and get put in a situation where we are not dependent on what the opposition side has to do.
And this strikes me as another one where Russell Brand's been accused by a number of women, anonymously in most cases, of serious allegations, rape and sexual assault and so on. He's vehemently denied them, and yet he's already being cancelled left, right, and centre by corporations, by politicians trying to stop tech companies paying him any money, and so on and so on. Almost like the world is acting as judge, jury, and executioner before this guy has had a chance. I've no idea where the truth lies yet with Russell Brand, other than he vehemently denies these allegations. But they are allegations, and they have not yet gone through due process. Why are we now doing this to people, where they get eviscerated, destroyed, cancelled, ruined, and convicted in the court of public opinion before they ever really get a chance to go through proper legal process?
Well, part of it is, you know, we have people that we admire and that we aspire to be, and sometimes for better or worse, they're often celebrities, and we love them, but we kind of hate them too because they're so annoying, because they're better than us in many ways, and that's why we admire them. And so on the one hand, we elevate them to a status that we probably shouldn't elevate them to, but on the other hand, we're pretty damn happy when we can, you know, fling them to the ground and peck off all their feathers, especially if we can do that at no cost to ourselves. And social media enables that tremendously, because you can generate a mob of accusers, and they can be anonymous, and you can do that in no time flat, and you can peck the feathers off someone, and you can walk away feeling real good about yourself, and you can be happy that you got to express your resentment and bitterness, and away you go. And of course, you sacrifice someone for doing that, but it's not you, and that's just fine. And so we're doing that nonstop. And that's what's happened to Russell. Now, Russell, you know, I mean, Russell's sexual behavior was exactly the kind of hedonistic nightmare that all the radicals and progressives are rah-rah-rahing about nonstop, except when it comes to visit them at home, let's say. And he was celebrated for his womanizing, and he's apologized for that, and he stopped drinking, and he stopped taking cocaine. And usually people who engage in licentious and impulsive behavior of the sort that's liable to get you in trouble are extraordinarily intoxicated by alcohol at the time of doing it. So the mere fact that he's, you know, become sober in recent years and also attempted to atone for his sins is a real plus. I think it was Nietzsche who said, however, that just because you think you're done with your past doesn't mean your past thinks it's done with you. And that's a dreadful statement, and everyone who's alive should, you know, be set back on their heels by the reality of that. But But hey, here we are. That's the world we live in. And I'm not so sure that the cancellation that...
Right, I was going to ask you on that. That if it turns out, though, that these women are telling the truth, and he is demonstrated to be proven to be a rapist and sexual assault, presumably you would agree that that is despicable and he should be punished for his crimes.
Well, as you said earlier, we have courts for determining that. And what constitutes the truth, especially in retrospect, particularly in the fog of an alcoholic encounter, let's say, is not an easy thing to determine. And that's why you have to trudge so horribly through the court system to try to make sense out of it. And of course, then what we do as citizens of a democratic and, at least in principle, functional society is accept the verdict of the court. But you don't do that beforehand. And you certainly don't presume that just because someone's accused, it's time to strip them and throw them out into the street.
I think what Jordan Peterson said here is so true. He recognizes the true extent of what it takes to cancel someone, and also the dangers and evil which goes behind it. But he also recognized that Russell Brand did not live a perfect life. There are cases where it potentially is the case that he is correct. And perhaps it is the case that Russell Brand is not correct and that he actually was a rapist. And we'll have to see via due process. And that comes back to innocence until proven guilty. It's very easy for people to accuse people of different things. It's very easy to accuse people of doing horrible things. But the reality, is that actually true? Well, you have to go through due process, either through the legal system or via good research. And I think everyone who actually gains anything successful in their life would recognize as an intuitive part in themselves that people have turned on them when they achieve success or when they've started doing a good thing. You could just check out my recent video called The Hell Before Success, a challenge from loneliness, which I'll link above, which I talk precisely about that process, that when you try to improve yourself, when you try to better yourself, you will always have opposition. And depending on how big your stature is, you will have opposition in relation to that. So as a result, it's a sad situation that we see with Russell Brand. But of course, as I've said, innocence until proven guilty. It perhaps is the case that he is a rapist, and if that's the case, he should be punished. And that's a despicable and despising thing to do. Rape is a horrible thing. However, the reality is we just have to see what happens, because we genuinely don't know the information enough, and we can't just cancel people based on pure women thought about, well, okay, that guy might be a rapist, that guy might not be a rapist. Who knows? We have to figure out what actually is the case before we actually start judging and canceling people.
War on the patriarchy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say the online world in many ways is a matriarchy. And the reason I would say that is because the online world enables female form antisocial behavior. And females who are antisocial use reputation savaging, bullying, and exclusion to gain their narcissistic pathway forward. There's a very well-documented psychiatric literature on female antisocial behavior. And the online world has many of the elements of a matriarchy. And so, well, there's the matriarchy for you. And I mean, I'm not saying it would be worse or better than the patriarchy, although the patriarchy is a foolish concept to begin with because it's such a radical oversimplification. But the idea that if we just replaced a hierarchy of men with a hierarchy of women, or no hierarchy at all, I mean, if you think that, you're so foolish that you should be put in university and educated by people who know what they're talking about. Of course, we can't do that in the universities anymore either. So
I think Jordan Peterson here raises a brilliant point. Right now, it seems to be presented that the patriarchy is in some sense only created as the assumption to oppress women. The problem is inequality. The reason for it is also inequality. That is the only way in which you actually solve this feminist critique. What actually is the case is not this feminist critique. What actually is the case is that the patriarchy was developed to the betterment of society and the development of the human race. That is not created for inequality. You see, those two concepts are completely different things. So if you're trying to object to a cause of a problem via a reason which it is not even based upon at all, well, you're going to be on a project doomed to failure by definition. So, I mean, this entire idea that in some sense, if you get rid of the patriarchy, that everything will be all right. Or if you get rid of the matriarchy, then everything will be all right. Or you put up a matriarchy, then everything will be all right, are completely ridiculous notions, because the idea of inequality was not even fundamentally there at the beginning to be discussed with. The question was never about inequality or equality. The discussion was what is best for the development and furthering of the human species as a whole. That was the discussion, and that's what has to be debated. What is best for the development of the human species as a whole? And that's what Jordan Peterson is trying to present. So this entire idea about feminism, patriarchy, and matriarchy is a complete delusion by the Matrix to try to switch up the power structures in this world.
That aside, it's taken a very long time to let the woke mob and the progressive propagandists take over the university systems, and Harvard's in the forefront, and so they managed it a little earlier and a little better. And I say that, by the way, with absolutely no satisfaction. I worked at Harvard in the 90s. I was a professor there from 92 to 97, and I loved it. And it was one high-functioning institute at that time, man. It really, really valued excellence, and it just didn't talk about that. It actually did it, and I loved being there. The students were great. The professors were great. I really liked my colleagues. It was an admirable place, and I still have colleagues there, and they told me straight out that they don't get to say what they think. The bureaucracy has taken over the institution. The inmates run the asylum. The professors are terrified too. I've had professors from the Kennedy School tell me this too, that they can't say what they think anymore. And so when you let the second raters and the pretenders in, and you let them whine about victimization and oppression, and you let them usurp the appropriate function of the university, you get exactly what you deserve. And that's exactly what happened at Harvard. And it's still happening. It's not improving. I can't really see how it will. I think that to flip the universities, you'd have to do to them what Musk did to Twitter, which is to fire 90% of the people who work there.
As someone at the best university in the world, it's not Harvard, it's Oxford. I have to say, luckily, it hasn't gotten too far here, so I can't comment too much about this entire situation at Harvard. I know friends at Harvard. I'm not exactly sure what they feel either, though I do have to say it is very concerning how the world is going, because at the end of the day, universities is where people are going through. People are being sent through universities, and if people are being sent through universities, and that the entire situation at university is a form of brainwashing and a form of basically a riot to try to just scare people. And honestly, it's very similar to the Cultural Revolution in China, where people were just so afraid to say anything that they just reported everyone, and about everyone just got killed. You reported someone, that guy got killed, they got beaten up, they got tortured, they got murdered. That person accused their family members, someone accused their mum, someone accused their dad of not being a communist, and then everyone just got killed completely. So as a result, that's a horrible situation, but it does look like we're moving to that way. Maybe not in the sense of violence, torture, mutilation, and death, but what we are talking about is, well, people are getting punished, people are getting cancelled for no reason at all, and it's just ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous the way the world is going, and it's very important that we fight against these trends, because ultimately, if we don't do anything about it, no one's going to do anything about it, and if we don't have consciousness and recognition of the problem, that problem is just going to spread forever and ad infinitum.
A lot of your fans, there's all sorts of Jordan Peterson groups that you can join who debate whether you really believe in God or not. So let's just get it on the table. Do you believe in God?
I don't think that's anybody's business. I think it's the most private question you can ask someone. But then I would say also, what's the right response to that? By their fruits you will know them. How's that?
Well, let me ask you a different question then. Do you think there is a God?
I'm terrified that there might be. How's that? And I'm not trying to be a smartass when I'm making that comment either. Like they say, it's an Old Testament saying, I believe, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and that is actually about as true a statement as you could manage in such a short phrase. And people have congratulated me. I was at the Buckley Institute last night. They were congratulating me on my courage. And I said this last night. It's like, you guys don't understand. It has nothing to do with courage. I'm just afraid of different things than the people who lie. And I'm afraid, for example, of what happens when you lose control of your tongue. And I said that back in 2016 when I first opposed the Canadian government. And people were, congratulating me. It's like, well, you're so brave to stand up to the government. It's like, I'm nowhere near as afraid of the government as I am of what happens when people lose control of their tongue. I studied totalitarianism since I was 13 years old in depth. And I know what happens when people lose control of their tongue. What happens is everything goes to hell. And I mean that metaphysically. I might even mean it theologically, but you can just say, don't even bother with that.
But what's fascinating?
Let's just mean it practically.
But what's it?
You know what? I have to say, I've always thought Jordan Peterson had a Schleiermachian view of God in the sense that he views God as almost this absolute fear that you have towards a certain object, which is completely abstract. It's not concrete at all. So whether God exists in itself is meaningless to him. But nevertheless, what he is talking about that religious feeling is man's facing of the infinite, the feeling of the infinite. Because everyone has feeling of the infinite, whether you like it or not, whether you're a materialistic atheist or you're the most religious theist. You have a feeling of the infinite in the world. You know that the world is infinite. Why? Because you know you're finite. If you're finite, the world must be infinite. And you have these constant questions of potentiality, of future in there. And that is by definition infinite, right? And in some sense, when you have that view in sight, what you realize is that you're finite, so you're afraid of your finitude. And that dynamic of you in face of that infinite is fundamentally the religious feeling that Jordan Peterson is presenting. And that's a very Schleiermachian view and not a Hegelian one. I mean, that's too much my theology side speaking. But nevertheless, there is that important notion there of how does one intuit God and how does one wrestle with the question of God? And that's a very profound and fundamental question, which I'm not exactly sure how we wrestle with, but it's definitely something to have. And I think Jordan Peterson is very wise in saying, I don't know whether God exists or not. He's not claiming that God exists, but nevertheless, he recognizes that dependence and that fear on whatever you call, let's say that proposition X that must exist, which leads to great fear in his life. That is what he views as God. And you know what? Fair play to him, right? As a metaphysician, you might say, well, that's just problematic. But as an existentialist, as a phenomenologist, you do see reason to that proposition and that presentation of affairs.
The first thing I would say is, what do you mean by believe? Like, do you think that a statement about the existence of God is something like a scientific theory? Do you think it's a list of facts? Is it a factual question? Does God exist or not? Is it a factual question like you're asking about whether a cup on a table exists or a plate on a table, an artifact in a room? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by believe? I'll stake my life on the proposition that God exists. How's that?
I mean, the philosopher Price actually argued that believe in and believe that are two different things. For example, you could say, I believe that this pen exists, but it doesn't mean I believe in the pen. Believe in implies some sense of attitude, a sense of worship towards this pen, which is a very important thing. And I apologize that lighting is just completely horrible, but I mean, the light's just coming in that way. I mean, I can't do much about it. But nevertheless, I believe in this pen is different from saying I believe that this pen exists. For example, you could say that the father believes in the child and also believes that the child exists, but it's very difficult to say, well, actually the father might believe that the child exists, but he might not believe in the child to actually be his child, or that the child is going to do a good job, right? So there are distinctions between the idea of belief and belief that, which are actually have been written about in literature.
Hey, sounds good to me. And so you might say, well, I said I pray always. So what does that mean? I'm trying to say the clearest words I can say. And I do that by paying attention. I'm listening to the words and feeling them as I move along, thinking, is that a firm foundation in the morass? Is that a bridge over the abyss? Is that word the right word? I do that when I'm writing. I do that when I'm talking. And I do that because I don't want to be in the abyss. And the pathway over the abyss is the truth.
Idea of prayer, that's a very interesting presentation. In some sense, it's almost close to the Catholic presentation of prayer, because Catholics, they often pray from prayer books, and then they pray whatever the saints prayed before them. For example, for meals, they'll say, bless us, Lord, in these thy gifts that we receive through thy bounty, through Christ thy Lord, amen. So when you're going through that prayer, when you're going through that structured prayer, you're meditating upon the significance of those phrases. So instead of saying, like the Protestants pray by saying, actually, I'm going to say something out of my heart, you're saying on a premeditated or pre-presentated or pre-written idea or notion of prayer that you're going to be saying, and then you meditate upon those ideas. And that's what Jordan Peterson seems to be saying about how he's praying. He's thinking about the significance of certain words or certain propositions that he believes to be true to the most fundamental degree, and that is what he considers as prayer.
There are things that are far worse than dying. So if you're only terrified of dying, you've hardly begun to plumb the depths of existential catastrophe.
Death is fairly...
You just don't have an imagination.
What could be worse than dying?
Being a prison guard at Auschwitz?
But you'd still be alive, even if you're witnessing horror. It's not death that the
Oh,
ultimate...
no, I'm thinking perpetrating it.
Right. You mean...
How about being an Auschwitz guard? How about being an Auschwitz guard who really enjoyed his job? How about that? That's worse than death, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
I mean that.
No, I see that.
That's hell, man.
Yeah, it's a living hell.
That's hell.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think there is? But do you think there's an actual hell, Jordan? Is there somewhere that people like that go to, which is hell?
Oh, definitely. Now, what relationship that has to what happens to you when you die, I have no idea. I mean, I don't think anybody's in a position to speak about what's truly beyond our ken, let's say. I don't think we understand consciousness at all. We don't understand time. We don't understand the relationship between finitude and the infinite landscape that surrounds us. That's all a great mystery, and I tend to leave that alone because I try not to speak about things that I can't speak about. But does hell exist? It's like, study history and see if you can figure it out for yourself. I mean,
does heaven exist?
There's nothing that's more obvious than that hell exists.
So does heaven exist?
Mao's China was hell.
Right, but so you're talking about hell on earth, but do you believe there's a hell after death?
Like I said, I don't speculate about such things. That's where my ignorance finds its, what would you say? That's where my knowledge finds its limit. I'm concerned enough about what I'm doing right now, right here, and leaving the rest of that. And, you know, so I have to leave it at that. The hell that I see as a potential on earth is sufficient as a deterrent, and it's of sufficient reality. You know, you can ask, well, is it eternal? Well, I would say, well, look, all totalitarian states are variants on a theme, let's say, and that theme persists. All archetypal stories are eternal. Everything that happened in the Bible happened and is happening and will continue to happen forever. It's part of the eternal human story. It's hyper real, and heaven and hell are part of that. What that means in the final analysis, I don't know. I mean, I think you asked in there, you know, hell is real, is heaven real? It's like, well, heaven is as far away from hell as you can get. That's a good way of thinking about it. I've spent my whole life trying to determine how you get as far away from being a camp guard at Auschwitz who enjoys his job as possible.
Blimey, there's actually quite a lot to unpack here philosophically speaking. I wasn't expecting that this would come to discussion on God, but it has. And I would say there's two things here, right? Firstly, about heaven being whatever is as far from hell as possible. That's a very interesting claim, because in traditional Christian theodicy or theology, they view hell or evil as a privation of good. So what is bad, what is evil in this world, is purely a result because good doesn't exist in it. But what Jordan Peterson is trying to say is, well, good is whatever is not evil. That is a very interesting twist. I'm not sure where that goes, but perhaps it is almost somewhat true. But then that would then suggest the spirit of evil is fundamentally more real than the spirit of good. And I'm not sure whether that is the correct claim. And if it's not the correct claim, is he then arguing that the spirit of evil is the same as the spirit of good? Well, that seems to fall into the Manichaean heresy. But I'm not exactly sure about the metaphysics of it, but it definitely is a very fascinating view that you could think about. Like, what actually is a fundamental layer of reality? Is it good or is it evil? That's a very interesting question. And number two, what is hell? I view that hell is a part of a conscience. And I'm not saying this in a metaphysical sense. I'm saying purely that our conscience is strong enough to make our living existence heaven or make our living existence hell, or act as a sufficient punishment for heaven or hell. For example, let's say, and Christians always get asked this, right? What if Adolf Hitler was to come to God at his death? Would he go to heaven? Well, number one, what does it mean to come to God at his death, and then would he go to heaven? But number two, apart from that, well, I would argue, I'll hypothesize that the infinite guilt that one feels upon a true realization of God, who is supreme and wonderful and beautiful, in that realization, the pain and knowledge of your own wrongdoings will be sufficient to justify whatever you consider as hell. I think that is a very good presentation of how strong the conscience is. And I would say that presentation of the conscience is precisely what makes something hell or heaven on earth, but also potentially what we call purgatory in this life.
You know, people don't understand. People think of God as, the joke is, a cosmic butler. You pray to have your wishes granted. It's like, he's not a genie. You want to pray? It's like, pray about your stupidity. Here's a prayer that'll work for sure. You want to see if prayer works? Here's one. This will work. Sit on the edge of your bed. Ask yourself, what bloody stupid thing do I continue to do that's making my life more miserable than it has to be, and everyone else's life around me, that I could give up, that I would give up? But you have to really want the answer. So you open yourself up in humility to a revelation. You'll get an answer. It won't be when you want. That's how you'll know it's true. But if you act on it, then your life will improve. And that's a proper prayer.
Yeah.
I would say that is truer than you could ever imagine. Like, I heard that phrase in a YouTube short like quite a while ago. And I have to say that's something which I've been trying to do recently. And it has been something which I would say has worked to some sense of things. I mean, you open yourself to flaws within yourself, in your conscience, and your subconscious, which you perhaps would not have realized otherwise. And that is something I'll highly recommend you to do.
I want to end.
Or your wife.
I want to end this part of the interview just with you, John, before we bring your daughter in. My team were curious whether you would be able, actually physically able, to answer questions with just one-word answers, because you think about things on such a high intellectual plane. You're very articulate. You're very thoughtful about them.
One-word answers are perhaps more abstract and more difficult than multi-word answers, because it's very easy to give a multi-word answer to anything. You could tell me to talk about Schleiermacher, and I would talk about him for all day. I could talk about Dostoevsky for all day. I could talk about Nietzsche for all day, due to my study and depth in their analysis. But if you asked me to say, well, hey, actually, describe Dostoevsky with one word, what would you say? That is a fundamentally very difficult question. Almost in some sense, you have to just answer Dostoevsky. That's how you describe Dostoevsky. But I mean, it's tautological, but almost the moment you state the tautology, you get another fundamental level of truth. It's a very fascinating thing, this one word thing. And I actually quite like it because it's a very interesting show.
Should people go to therapy, or can it really screw you up?
Depends on the therapist and why they go. It can be very, very helpful. There's no real difference between a therapeutic relationship and a genuine relationship. And so the question really is, are genuine relationships beneficial to people? And the answer to that is, of course. And you might say, well, can you mimic a genuine relationship in a therapy practice? And the answer is yes. It's not as good as a marriage. If it's a good marriage, it's maybe not even as good as a great friendship. But if you lack both of those, then a therapeutic alliance can be extraordinarily helpful. Now, if your therapist is incautious and poorly trained and foolish and ideologically addled, then it can be a complete bloody nightmare. But everything's like that, right? If you go to a surgeon who doesn't know what he's doing, well, you know, he'll cut off the wrong leg, and that's often not a good thing.
Who is the one philosopher we should all read?
Oh, I don't know if there's any philosopher we should all read. Nietzsche.
Breakfast, lunch,
Nietzsche,
or
he's
dinner?
deadly.
What, breakfast, lunch, or dinner? What's the most important meal of the day?
Nietzsche's good, but I have to say Dostoevsky is my favorite. Nietzsche's, I suppose, if you want something interesting, read Nietzsche. If you want something to truly appreciate the existence of the world and people's relationship with it, Dostoevsky is more profound. And even Nietzsche himself writes that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist he ever had anything to learn from. And that tells you something, man. That does tell you something.
And finally, on this part of the...
No, it's a good way to get your day going.
The final part of this
Symbolism
section,
could be read into
what is
anything.
the best and worst thing about being Jordan Peterson?
The worst? I'm a bit much,
And the best?
you might say. So
What's the best thing?
I'm sort of running in all directions very rapidly, and so that can be a bit much. It's hard on people around me. I'm a bit much, man.
And what's the best thing about you?
Probably the same thing.
The best thing about being me?
Yeah.
It's overwhelming, really. Well, the deep appreciation that people have for what I've been doing. It's stunning. It's soul destroying,
no.
but it's amazing.
Is it not soul enhancing? I mean, I feel it when I do interviews with you, the reaction I get from people, just how much you mean to them. I mean, I can imagine it's
Yeah, well, that's a bit much, you know. I mean, look, when I go, wherever I go, it's so strange, because wherever I go, it's like I have friends there, because I walk down the street and people wave at me and, you know, they call out my name, and it's a bit much.
It's amazing.
It's really something, but
It's amazing.
But it's hard to, it's hard to wrap my head around it. It's very hard to wrap my head around it. And especially because it happened to me, you know, when I was, well, I didn't when I was older than 50. It's been quite an adjustment. I wouldn't say it's one I've made, and it's an immense responsibility. And I'm not complaining about that at all. I'd be a fool to complain, an ungrateful fool. But it's you know, it's a strange thing to have far more than you could ever imagine.
What do you mean?
Well, that's my life. I have far more than I could ever imagine. I didn't think it was possible.
I mean, you become somebody who, in the later stage of a life.
Now you did it again. You got me again. God
Well,
damn it.
yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, you are an emotional person. I know that. But I think it's also interesting to me what makes you emotional. And in a way, it's similar to why you were emotional last time I talked to you, is that you are very acutely aware of the influence you now have over so many millions of people. And I think you feel that responsibility profoundly. And I think that's what triggers in you an emotion.
Yeah, it's gratitude.
No, I think that's a brilliant place to end off this video. You know, I have to say, one of the things which I really appreciate, and I think the same thing goes with Jordan Peterson, is that ultimately his expression of emotion is a result of responsibility and a sense of love for those around him. And that is, I think, the highest form of appreciation, the highest form of love, and the highest form of care for people. And that's ultimately something we should all work for. It's not something we should be condemning by saying, oh, he's crying or whatever, that's why he's emasculate. That's a ridiculous argument to claim and a ridiculous argument to sustain. The most important thing is, does he love the world, and is he trying his best to bear the cross that he has been called to bear? If the answer is yes, then I think we should all support him. And I think he has done an amazing job to just show the love of God and the love that he has to those around us, and he has made a positive impact on a lot of people's lives. Because I've mentored a lot of young youth, like teenagers, 14 to 18-year-old boys in society, and the impact that Jordan Peterson has had on them has univocally been positive. And I can't thank Jordan Peterson enough for the work he's done, even though, of course, there's things which I disagree with him. At the same time, I do think there's a lot of positive there as well. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one, and I'll see you soon.